Greetings from Istanbul. My name is Imke van Heerden and I'm presenting at the workshop on Evaluation and Comparison of NLP Systems. This workshop is co-located at EMNLP 2021. In this short video, my co-author Anil Bash and I focus on the evaluation of creative text generation, in particular poetry generation. Please note that this is a non-archival presentation. It is entirely based on our article, AI as Author, Bridging the Gap Between Machine Learning and Literary Theory. This was recently published in the Journal of Artificial Intelligence Research. Today, we share some thoughts from the article that are pertinent to the subject of evaluation. Now, why are we interested in creative text generation? I am a literary scholar and lead a small team, AI as Author, based at Koç University. And we bring literary studies into conversation with natural language generation. We're interested in the generation of writing that might be considered literary, for example, poetry and drama. Ultimately, this presentation is a call for increased collaboration between NLG and literary scholars. The presentation centers on evaluation as an illustration of possible insights that may arise through such collaboration. I want to start us off with an example. If you're working on poetry generation, you're probably familiar with HOPKINS and KIELA's 2017 study. They succeeded in generating high-quality rhythmic verse. To evaluate their results, they conducted an indistinguishability test. And the evaluators found their generated verse to be more human-like than those actually written by humans. Now, from a literary perspective, my attention was drawn to the following. Although this is not explored in the study, and understandably so, half of the group of human evaluators misjudged the writing of Dickinson, Dryden, Tennyson, and Shakespeare as AI-generated. I'll say that again. Half mistook the writing of literary giants as machine-generated. Shakespeare's fairy song, which you can see on the slide, received the lowest human likeness score. Now, of course, this could be related to unfamiliarity with Elizabethan English. However, as another instance, Dickinson's I'm Nobody was misjudged as well. It is, of course, open to discussion whether the evaluation results would coincide if evaluators were presented with only contemporary literary works, that is, written in present-day English. But nonetheless, the results might suggest that participants mistook difficulties and peculiarities as flaws, as an indication of AI. Perhaps this reveals a misunderstanding of poetry. Poetic texts have been described as ambiguous, confusing, elusive, inaccurate, etc. And poetry is a typically dense form of literature that may employ ambiguous and abstract language. It may offer interpretive difficulties. According to Fab, some poetry, including traditional poetry, is for social or aesthetic reasons intended to be difficult. Now, I just mentioned ambiguity. Ambiguity is any verbal nuance which gives room for alternative reactions to the same piece of language. It lies among the very roots of poetry, according to Empson. Now, after all, a poem may say one thing, but mean another. The point is that creative writing, for example, poetry, can be different than standard factual informative text. And in fact, the difference between ordinary and poetic language is a central theoretical concern. From a formalist perspective, for instance, new and strange uses of language make poetry poetry and not a weather report. There's a concept here that comes to mind, and that is that of defamiliarization, the artistic technique of presenting familiar things in an unfamiliar way, deliberately, to inspire new insights and emotions. I think many NLG researchers are drawn to poetry because of rhyme and meter. However, if the aim is to generate text that can be truly considered poetic, we must remember that not all kinds of poetry possess rhyme or meter, and certainly not all kinds are traditional. Poets use countless tools and techniques to achieve defamiliarization, to take readers out of their comfort zones, if you will. For instance, asyntactic structure, showing no syntactical rules or regularity. Anastrophe, a deliberate change of word order, and a diplosis, repetition for special effect, and ambiguity, of course. On the slide, you can see two well-known examples of typographic experimentation by Ezra Pound and E. Cummings. Rhyme and meter are clearly absent in A Leaf Falls. Rules or conventions are perhaps, as mentioned, what is appealing about poetry generation. However, simply put, for many, rules were made to be broken. In fact, creativity has been associated with a departure from norms, and we agree that creative endeavors must deal not with the predictable and repeatable, the stuff of normal science, but with the unique and unrepeatable. Thus, using strict adherence to rules as an indication of human likeness is not necessarily effective. Let's look at another prominent example. OpenAI mentioned weakness in GPT-2. According to Radford and colleagues, at times the model generates failures, such as fires happening underwater. If the aim is to produce clear, informative text, yes, this topic would be unsuitable. Metaphor, which is common in poetry, may look like an error if interpreted literally. However, if read figuratively, the notion of fires happening underwater is rather intriguing from a literary perspective. Therefore, what might be considered a weakness in a standard, factual text could be considered a strength in a creative text. So with this in mind, a poem that is difficult to understand, that is peculiar, that is strange, or a poem that bends or breaks rules, that type of poem does not necessarily lack humanity. In fact, difficulty, peculiarity, complexity, ambiguity, novelty, and innovation, these are important characteristics of many kinds of poetry. Therefore, when these qualities are present in generated poetry, we believe it does not signify weakness or failure. Let's turn to Van der Lee's 2021 review of human evaluation criteria. We are not disputing that these are appropriate for standard text generation. However, the prioritization of these evaluation categories in poetry generation specifically might be counterproductive if it loses sight of or seeks to eliminate essential poetic qualities. And this is due to the differences between ordinary and poetic language. In conclusion, understanding that poetic language may pose a deliberate challenge to interpretation also poses a challenge to evaluation in poetry generation. And we suggest that literariness, or that which constitutes a text as literary or poetic, is understudied in relation to text generation, and that literary theoretical perspectives would be beneficial to understanding how meaning and emotion are conveyed in this art form. I have to mention that although it might seem obvious for literary scholars to be involved in this field, it is surprisingly uncommon. There are many recent approaches to creative text generation that do not draw on literary expertise. Collaboration could help rethink priorities and help reconceptualize failure in creative language models. Moreover, task-specific or genre-specific evaluation criteria could be developed with the assistance of literary scholars that specialize in certain kinds of poetry. As a reminder, this presentation is based on our paper, AI as Author. We are very grateful to our funders, the Scientific and Technological Research Council of Turkey. And I also want to mention that after the publication of this article, we continued exploring some of these ideas in 2 further papers that might be of interest. We would like to end with a few questions. Please note that we are not suggesting that anything goes. We do wonder whether AI-generated text will always be met with skepticism and scrutiny. If we are able to accept experimentation and ambiguity, for instance, in human-written poetry, could we do so in AI-written poetry as well? But how would one do that? And how would one separate nonsense from potentially thought-provoking formulations? How could evaluation criteria do justice to the uniqueness and power of poetry? These and many related questions should be raised, which are all open to debate, and we would love to hear the community's thoughts. Thank you very much for your time and attention.